Dr. Rathod, Edward Said's concept of Orientalism as a discourse has been pivotal in postcolonial studies. Could you elaborate on what makes this idea so influential?
Certainly, Said's critique in Orientalism exposes how the West constructed the East in ways that justified imperial domination. By drawing on Foucault's theory of discourse, he showed that Orientalism isn't just knowledge but a power-knowledge system.
Fascinating. So, Orientalism is more than just a stereotype or cultural image. How does this manifest in practical terms?
For example, British literature often depicted the East as exotic and static, which reinforced the notion of Western superiority. This us versus them framework allowed Western powers to rationalize their colonial activities.
What about the counterarguments that suggest Orientalism is a cultural issue, not a political one?
While some argue it's cultural, Said demonstrated its political and economic implications. Orientalist representations supported colonial economies by marginalizing Eastern voices, reinforcing Western hegemony and control.
Looking ahead, how can Said's ideas guide us in dismantling such hegemonic structures today?
Said's work urges a critical examination of how power operates through representation. By recognizing and challenging these narratives, we can foster a more equitable global discourse.
Dr. Rathod, let's delve into the binary logic within Orientalism. How does this binary framework function in Said's analysis?
Said argued that Orientalism relies on binary oppositions, the West as rational and progressive versus the East as irrational and backward. This allows the West to define itself positively by contrasting with an imagined other.
And how does Eurocentrism intersect with these binaries in Orientalism?
Eurocentrism underpins these binaries by casting Western values as universal and superior. Said critiques this by highlighting how it erases the complexities of non-Western societies, reducing them to simplistic stereotypes.
Critics have pointed out that Said's focus might overlook internal complexities. How does he address this?
Said acknowledged these critiques, emphasizing that his analysis aimed to reveal how Western representations, despite their diversity, often shared a common goal of legitimizing dominance.
Looking forward, how can we move beyond these binaries to achieve a more nuanced understanding of global cultures?
By embracing diverse perspectives and questioning Eurocentric assumptions, we can develop a more inclusive global narrative that respects the intricacies of all cultures.
Dr. Rathod Said distinguishes between latent and manifest Orientalism. Could you clarify these concepts for our listeners?
Latent Orientalism refers to deep-seated cultural assumptions about the Orient, while manifest Orientalism is the explicit expression of these assumptions in texts or policies. Essentially, latent Orientalism is the underlying bias and manifest is how it appears.
Can you provide an example of how these two forms interact in real-world scenarios?
Take the portrayal of Middle Eastern countries in Western media. The persistent depiction of these regions as chaotic stems from latent Orientalism, which then manifests in news coverage that emphasizes instability over progress.
Some argue that manifest Orientalism is evolving with global awareness. Does this mean latent Orientalism is also changing? How might Said's insights into latent Orientalism inform future scholarly work?
His insights encourage scholars to probe beneath surface narratives and question the persistent underlying assumptions that shape cultural and academic discourse. Said advocated for reclaiming histories and cultures from Eurocentric narratives. This involves challenging dominant representations and promoting indigenous perspectives, effectively decolonizing the academic and cultural fields.
But how do we balance this with the risk of creating new forms of othering within decolonization efforts?
Said cautioned against replacing one form of exclusion with another. He argued for a nuanced understanding that acknowledges colonial legacies without resorting to simplistic solutions like nativism.
With that in mind, how can Said's work inspire current and future generations in their pursuit of cultural equity?
By fostering critical engagement with race, identity, and global inequality, Said's work inspires us to continue questioning and expanding our understanding of cultural dynamics, ultimately striving for a more just and inclusive world.
Edward Said's Orientalism is often credited as a cornerstone of postcolonial studies. Dr. Rathod, could you elaborate on how Said's work reshaped our understanding of East-West dynamics?
Certainly, Said's Orientalism exposed the systematic way Western scholarship portrayed the East as exotic and inferior. For example, he argued this portrayal was used to justify colonial domination, creating a framework where the East was seen as incapable of self-governance.
However, some critics suggest that Said's analysis oversimplifies the West's role. They argue that not all Western scholars intended to dominate. What are your thoughts on this counterargument?
That's a valid critique. While some Western scholars might have had genuine interest in Eastern cultures, Said's point was about the dominant discourse that perpetuated stereotypes. This doesn't negate positive interactions but highlights an overarching narrative of control.
Moving forward, how has Said's work influenced contemporary postcolonial studies and global perceptions?
His work laid the groundwork for questioning power structures in cultural representations. Today, it inspires scholars to deconstruct narratives and promote a more inclusive understanding of history, emphasizing voices that were once marginalized.
Let's delve into identity and hybridity in postcolonial literature. Dr. Rathod, how do these themes manifest in literary works?
Postcolonial texts often depict characters grappling with mixed identities due to colonial influence. Homi Bhabha's concept of hybridity illustrates this, showing how blending cultures creates new, resistant identities. For instance, novels often portray protagonists caught between old traditions and new colonial realities.
Yet, some argue that hybridity can dilute cultural authenticity. How do postcolonial writers address this concern?
Indeed, there's a fear of losing cultural purity. However, many authors use hybridity to highlight resilience rather than loss. By embracing mixed identities, they challenge rigid cultural binaries and celebrate the richness of cultural fusion.
What future directions do you see for postcolonial identity exploration in literature?
Looking ahead, as globalization continues, literature will likely explore even more complex identity dynamics, reflecting increasing cross-cultural interactions and the evolving nature of identity itself.
Language plays a crucial role in postcolonial literature. Dr. Rathod, how do writers use language to resist colonial power?
Language is both a tool of oppression and resistance. Writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o advocate for using indigenous languages as a form of cultural preservation and resistance. This initiative counters colonial languages' dominance by reclaiming native linguistic identities.
Some critics argue writing in native languages limits global reach. How do postcolonial authors navigate this dilemma?
That's a common concern. Authors often use bilingual texts or translate works to balance authenticity with accessibility. This approach not only preserves cultural essence but also broadens readership and fosters cross-cultural dialogue.
In the future, how might technology influence language use in postcolonial literature?
Technological advances like AI-driven translation tools could democratize access to diverse languages, allowing post-colonial literature to reach wider audiences without losing linguistic integrity.
Reclaiming history is a pivotal theme in post-colonial literature. Dr. Rathod, how do writers reconstruct historical narratives?
Post-colonial authors revisit history from the colonized perspective, correcting misrepresentations. For example, they highlight indigenous achievements overlooked by colonial narratives, thus restoring historical balance and dignity.
However, some argue that these revisions risk romanticizing pre-colonial pasts. How do writers address this balance?
Writers are mindful of this. They aim for a nuanced portrayal that acknowledges pre-colonial complexities while critiquing colonial distortions. The goal is not idealization but a truthful, multifaceted historical representation. As global awareness grows, post-colonial literature will likely embrace even more diverse narratives, incorporating lesser-known histories and voices, thus enriching global understanding of shared pasts.
Dr. Rathod, Edward Said's critique of universalism is pivotal in post-colonial discourse. How does Said challenge the notion that Western values are universally applicable?
Said argues that Western norms often erase the rich specificities of non-Western societies, reducing them to stereotypes. For instance, depicting non-Western cultures as exotic simplifies their complex realities, much like how a single lens cannot capture the entirety of a landscape.
Indeed, but some critics argue that Said's focus on Western representations may inadvertently perpetuate Eurocentrism. How does Said address these internal complexities?
Said acknowledges this critique, suggesting that while his work focuses on Western portrayals, it's crucial to also consider indigenous narratives. He advocates for a decolonized framework where non-Western societies reclaim their voices, akin to a choir that harmonizes diverse melodies.
As we look forward, what steps do scholars need to take to move beyond these entrenched universalist perspectives?
Future scholarship should embrace intercultural dialogue, recognizing that no single culture holds a monopoly on truth. This involves fostering environments where diverse viewpoints are not just acknowledged but integrated into the mainstream, promoting a global tapestry of ideas.
Let's delve into power dynamics. Said posits that Eurocentric representations are deeply entrenched in power structures. Could you elaborate on this?
Certainly, Said highlights how these representations legitimize colonial domination by depicting Eastern societies as inferior. It's like a narrative alchemy that transforms cultural differences into justifications for control, much like how explorers used maps to claim lands.
However, some argue that Said's focus neglects the economic aspects underpinning colonialism. How does he reconcile cultural critique with material realities?
While Said emphasizes cultural narratives, he acknowledges the intertwined nature of cultural and material realms. He suggests that deconstructing cultural stereotypes can pave the way for addressing economic disparities, much like unraveling a knot to understand its core.
Looking ahead, how can these insights reshape contemporary global interactions? Decolonization is a significant theme in Said's work. How does he propose non-Western societies reclaim their narratives?
Said advocates for challenging dominant Eurocentric narratives and asserting indigenous perspectives. This involves a cultural renaissance where histories are rewritten by the communities themselves, much like authors reclaiming the pen to tell their own stories.
Yet, Said warns against simplistic solutions like nativism. What nuanced approach does he suggest for decolonization?
He calls for a balanced approach that acknowledges colonial legacies while embracing cultural hybridity. It's akin to weaving a new fabric that incorporates both traditional and contemporary threads, creating a richer and more inclusive tapestry. Future strategies should include creating platforms for marginalized voices, revising curricula to reflect diverse histories, and promoting cross-cultural collaborations. These steps can transform academic landscapes into global forums of knowledge exchange. Said's work has left an indelible mark by challenging dominant narratives and inspiring scholars to question Eurocentric assumptions. It's like a lighthouse guiding ships through the fog of cultural stereotypes towards clearer understandings.
However, some debates persist. Marxist scholars argue Said overlooks material structures. How do these critiques shape current discourse? Considering these discussions, what future directions might post-colonial studies take?
The field will likely evolve by incorporating interdisciplinary approaches, blending cultural, economic, and political analyses. This holistic perspective can foster deeper insights into global inequalities and inspire transformative actions.